3. The post-war plots. The Churchill plan to establish in the post-war world a reactionary Eastern Europe, subservient to Western imperialism, ended in fiasco. Eastern Europe was liberated by the Red Army. The resistance to Axis occupation had been led in these countries by the working people, who had in their turn been led by the working class and the communist parties. The old ruling classes, capitalists and landlords, the old leaders of the old state machines, generals and police and judges, had to a large measure exposed themselves as quislings and Axis collaborators. Though unevenly, and not yet in all countries decisively, the people led by the working class were ready to march forward in friendship and cooperation with the Soviet Union towards people's democracy, where the working people would be the rulers. The Churchill plan had failed. But it was not given up. Far from it. Defeated for the moment, Western imperialism returned with more intense energy to the struggle to turn history backwards, and to restore to Eastern Europe the old regimes that the people had cast out. In Greece they did it by violence, assassination, war against those who had led the resistance struggle against the Axis, war against the Greek people, war waged in collaboration with the Greek quislings. In the other countries of Eastern Europe, where the strength of the Soviet Union could prevent an open war of intervention, they tried to repeat the Greek pattern, but through more disguised methods of plot, putsch and subterfuge. First they tried to restore the old regimes by direct counter-revolution of the old ruling classes organized in fascist or secret militarist bands. In Poland, for example, the fascist bands, financed and armed by Western imperialism, cost the lives of thousands of Polish Democrats. But these plans failed. Next they turned to the right-wing leaders of the old agrarian and peasant parties, men like Maniu in Romania, Ferenc Nagy in Hungary, Mikołajczyk in Poland, Kmeto, Dimitrov and Petkov in Bulgaria. But these plots were foiled. Then they turned their hopes to the right-wing leaders of the old social democratic parties, plotted against the growing unity of the working class and against the new people's democratic regimes that were being established. But these plots also were foiled. So, by 1948, it was the hidden agents of imperialism inside the communist and workers' parties and above all the organizing center of these agents, the Titoite clique in the Yugoslav Communist Party, who now became their main weapon in their imperialist plot to overthrow the people's democratic regimes and set up East European governments subservient to the West. Thus by the middle of 1948 the Titoite groupings that had been an auxiliary, a reserve weapon of Western imperialism, became its principal agency in Eastern Europe. The plots and conspiracies of imperialism against countries of socialism or people's democracy are not simple and do not follow a single line. The imperialists work through all possible channels, dispossessed landlords or big industrialists, former leaders of the army, police or secret police, through kulaks, nationalists, degenerate elements, drug addicts, former common criminals, through renegade communists or right-wing labor leaders, through agents and provocateurs inserted into revolutionary organizations. They tried to keep all possible contacts, all possible counter-revolutionary elements on their string at the same time. But they usually put their main support, at any given time, on one special group, whom they hope to use to restore to power a regime of reaction that will carry out their orders. This was shown clearly enough in the successive imperialist attempts to overthrow the dictatorship of the proletariat in the Soviet Union, and to restore a Russian capitalism subservient to the West. First they tried through the open war of intervention to base themselves on the Tsarist White Guards, on the Russian landlords and capitalists, the old officers and police. When this failed, for a long period they tried to base their counter-revolutionary conspiracies on the kulaks, and when the kulaks were finally eliminated as a class, it was the secret agents of imperialism inside the Communist Party, the Trotskyite and other parallel opposition groups hitherto a reserve, who became in the middle 1930s their main hope, their main weapon, for the overthrow of socialism and the reversal of history. So, too, in Eastern Europe after the Second World War. At first the Titoites outside Yugoslavia were a reserve weapon. They were instructed, through the medium of the Yugoslav Titoites, to help the growth of the other reactionary groupings. The Kostov trial showed how Kostov and his fellow conspirators were used to make the Bulgarian people discontented with the new people's authority. Reich was at first instructed by the U.S. agent Martin Himmler in the autumn of 1946 to aid the right-wing Hungarian plots by weakening the left through internal disruption. Martin Himmler, told me that the different right-wing forces of Hungary are concentrated mainly under the leadership of Ferenc Nagy, Béla Kovács and Béla Varga. The right-wing forces of the Smallholders Party, the right-wing forces of the Peasant Party led by Imre Kovács, the right-wing Social Democratic forces led by Péter Stur, Kathleen and Schelig, as well as the very active underground Hertheist and former Szalasi fascist forces which had no organization of their own, were very active in working to take over the power of government and to remove the left-wing revolutionary forces, that is the Communist Party and the left-wing Social Democrats, from governmental power. He wanted to give me the tasks of dissolving the forces of the greatest unit of the left-wing revolutionary forces, the Communist Party, by organizing a separate fraction against Rákosi in the party led by Rákosi, in order to ensure the seizure of power by the right-wing forces. At the same time, Martin Himmler told me that in all probability this would be my last talk with him and with the representatives of the American intelligence agencies in general, for they would hand over their whole network to the Yugoslavs, and in the future I would get instructions for further work through Yugoslav channels. Reich's testimony. Verbatim report of Reich trial, pages 4748. Later, when other groupings of a right-wing character had been compromised, Reich received special American instructions via Rankovic to aid the right-wing Social Democratic leaders, who were now receiving full Western backing. Another message from Rankovic at that time, which is closely connected with the message about the elections, was that I was to connive at the especially strong anti-People's Democratic, anti-Soviet and pro-Anglo-Saxon policy of the right-wing Social Democrats during the elections, and as a member of the Secretariat to try to get them to put up with it within the party leadership, within the Communist Party leadership. The content of the message was that I could argue with the party that one cannot fight on two fronts during the elections. One cannot fight against a right wing of a fascist nature, and at the same time against the right wing of a party which is after all a workers' party. Therefore one should allow free scope to the activities of the right-wing Social Democrats on the basis of the policy of choosing the lesser evil. In connection with this, Rankovic's message pointed out that to his knowledge the right-wing Social Democrats, how he knew about it I do not know, were trying to use the elections, the election campaign, and later the election results, to blackmail the Communist Party and for the capture of various leading positions in the state apparatus. His message, based on the above political reasoning, said that I should argue within the party leadership in favor of allowing the right-wing Social Democrats various posts with the aim of neutralizing them. If needs be, I should argue that we are making this concession temporarily and will win them back later. Reich's testimony, verbatim report of Reich trial, p. 57. Thus at a certain stage of post-war history, due to the weaknesses of the imperialists, and not to their strength, due to their failures and not to their successes, the Titoites in Yugoslavia, who had been a reserve weapon of imperialism, were brought forward as a principal instrument of Western policy, and, similarly, their stooges in Hungary, Bulgaria, etc., were brought forward from a secondary to a primary role. This evolution was well summed up in the final prosecutor's speeches at both the Reich and the Kostov trials. The Hungarian People's Prosecutor, Dr. Gyula Elapi, said, there were two stages in the policy of the Tito clique. During the first stage, when the fight between bourgeois reaction and people's democracy in the East European countries was as yet undecided, and one could still count on reaction getting the upper hand in the struggle of the forces in the people's democracies, the Tito clique remained in reserve, did not yet show their teeth and did not yet come forward openly as the anti-Soviet stormtroopers of American imperialism. They appeared as the stormtroopers only in the second stage of development in Eastern Europe, when the democratic and socialist forces had already won a decisive victory in these countries and the organizations of the anti-Soviet, pro-imperialist political forces could no longer be entrusted to the defeated groups of open reaction, just as Yugoslavia was still in reserve in the years immediately after the war and only later became the open stormtroopers of imperialism. So in the same way Reich did not immediately, in the first stages of Hungarian democratic development, come into prominence, but remained an instrument in the hands of reaction at home and abroad. Only later, after the decisive victories of the Hungarian working class and after the routing of the different reactionary forces, did he come into prominence and, as the Tito clique's candidate for the post of prime minister, become, if only temporarily, the head of Hungarian reaction. The Titoites and their imperialist bosses did not turn to Reich because of his beautiful eyes, but because they could no longer turn to Ferenc Nagy and Mindszenthy. Verbatim report of Reich trial, p. 268. And the Bulgarian prosecutor, Vladimir Dimchev, stated in his concluding speech at the Kostov trial, when the attempts of the American and British intelligence to organize and hurl against the Bulgarian People's Republic the forces of reaction and fascism in our country came to naught, they then began to place their hopes on the conspiratorial group of Trotsky, who had long rendered them espionage services. In this conspiratorial plan of theirs against our country, the Anglo-American imperialists used as their chief tool the treacherous espionage gang of Tito and his confederates. Verbatim report of the Kostov trial, p. 509. This is how the Titoites, who had been an important reserve weapon of imperialism, became by mid-1948 the main tool of Western imperialist plotting for counter-revolutions in Eastern Europe. How could the Yugoslav Titoites and their contacts in other East European countries best serve their Anglo-American masters? How is the Titoites' plot against the peoples of Europe to be carried through? What were the main parts and stages of this plot? It was clear that the task of the Titoites, even when they were only a reserve weapon of imperialism, was not only to prepare counter-revolutionary putsches against the people's democratic regimes of Eastern Europe, not only to disrupt the left, but as an essential corollary to try and undermine among the masses of Eastern Europe their love and admiration of the Soviet Union, their deep friendship and gratitude. This was no easy task. It could not be undertaken directly, frontally, but only indirectly, and as part of a whole process. A frontal attack on the USSR would have been indignantly rejected by the mass of the East European peoples and would have at once exposed the Titoites. The plan, therefore, was to draw the peoples away from the Soviet Union in the first place by boosting Tito Yugoslavia, and the Titoite leaders, putting them in the center of all propaganda. By stimulating interest and enthusiasm for Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union was to be put in the background. Later, this great prestige could be used by the Titoites to continue the process of weaning the East European peoples away from friendship with the Soviet Union, and, step by step, into the orbit of Western imperialism. Thus Yugoslavia would not only itself be taken by the Titoites out of the family of progressive states into the avid grasp of imperialism, but would take with it the other East European nations. This process was, of course, complementary to the process of preparing right-wing putsches and right-wing governments inside the East European states. Such was the essence of the Tito plan that Reykjavik outlined to Reich at their meeting in Kelbia in December 1947. The plan was that since the right-wing forces in all the people's democratic countries had been defeated one by one, Yugoslavia had to undertake the role of organizer and leader of the overthrow of the people's democratic regimes. Yugoslavia, however, said Reykjavik, could not in Tito's evaluation do this by openly coming out with the announcement of such a policy. She could not do this because both among the masses of the people in Yugoslavia, and in most of the people's democracies too, friendship towards the Soviet Union had strong and deep roots and the socialist camp had immense strength. Therefore, Tito had to carry out this policy under camouflage, by deception. According to Reykjavik, Tito conceived this policy of deception in the following way. First of all, Yugoslavia had a great attraction for the rest of the people's democracies because of the war, or rather because of the heroic partisan battles of the peoples of Yugoslavia. So Tito thought that this attraction, this popularity, outwardly emphasizing and stressing friendship with the Soviet Union and the people's democracies, must be taken advantage of and emphasized in order that, rallying around Yugoslavia, various federations should be concluded between Yugoslavia and the other countries. Tito wanted to carry out this grouping around Yugoslavia in a deceitful manner, again cloaked in socialist, pro-Soviet and pro-people's democratic guise, by referring to the fact that Yugoslavia had an important strategic role against the aggressive policy of the United States and the Anglo-Saxons in general, because of her geographical situation. Reich's testimony, verbatim report of Reich trial, pages 6364. The Tito plan included measures to set up all manner of Balkan and East European organizations, ranging from state federations to youth organizations, with Yugoslavia at the center. The first step in weaning people and states away from the Soviet Union was to group them around Tito Yugoslavia, with the Titoid betrayers of the heroic Yugoslav liberation movement hiding behind the great prestige that the sacrifices of the Yugoslav people had rightly won. The Tito plan therefore involved the boosting of Tito to the skies. Tito's visit to Bulgaria in connection with the signing of the Treaty for Friendship, Collaboration and Mutual Assistance was about to take place. I took all the necessary steps that he might be welcomed most pompously, and with greatest glamour. Tito arrived in all the splendor of his imagined grandeur, traveling by special train preceded and followed by 2 other guard trains, together with his personal guards. Kostov's written testimony, verbatim report of Kostov trial, p. 106. It involved the effort to form a Yugoslav, Bulgarian federation in which Bulgaria would become the 7th Yugoslav state, subordinated to Yugoslavia and Tito. It involved all sorts of plans for a Danubian confederation centered around Tito Yugoslavia. It involved the effort to set up a whole series of Balkan and East European federations of organizations, sports, youth, women, trade union, etc., centered at Belgrade. Make Belgrade the center. This was the first step in the process of weaning away from the Soviet Union and towards the West, within the framework of the Great Plan previously mentioned, the substance of which was to wrench these countries from the side of the Soviet Union and draw them over to the American side. Tito, together with the Americans, worked out a detailed plan, a regional plan, the plan of Balkan Federation. This Balkan Federation would have consisted, according to the plan, of Yugoslavia as the leading power, of Hungary, Bulgaria, Albania, and perhaps later of Romania. Palfi's testimony, verbatim report of Reich trial, p. 92. There was another very important message from Reykjavik at this time, the second half of 1947, which again I could not explain, and he only enlarged upon in Kelbia. This message read, should a proposal be handed to the Hungarian government from the Yugoslav government concerning the setting up of youth, women's and trade union Balkan federations, I, as a member of the government, should try to support it with all my might. Reich's testimony, verbatim report of Reich trial, p. 57. The publication of the resolution of the Communist Information Bureau in mid-1948 struck a heavy blow at the Tito plan. The Titoites could no longer take their time, and on American orders spurred on their Reichs and Kostovs to hasten their preparations for the assassination of the best communist leaders of their countries and their plans for the overthrow of the people's democratic regimes. But the vigilance of the people, led by the communist parties, did not allow them to carry through their plans. IV. Tito's plot against Albania. The trial of Albanian Titoites, which opened in May 1949, showed that ever since 1943 the Yugoslav Titoites had been carrying out a policy hostile to the interests of the Albanian people, that they had, indeed, with the aid of certain elements inside the Albanian Communist Party, been continuing the old imperialist policy of Mussolini. The small but very courageous Albanian people rose up alongside the Yugoslav people to combat the Axis occupation forces. They formed partisan units under the leadership of the newly formed Albanian Communist Party. Already in the spring of 1943, Tito sent one of his principal agents, Vikmanovic Tempo, to Albania, ostensibly to establish relations with the Albanian partisans, but actually to set up a secret Titoid opposition headed by Kusi Gzoks and Pandi Christo inside the Albanian Communist Party. With this, the Titoite effort to gain control of the Albanian party began. The first stage of Titoite intervention into the affairs of the Albanian patriots was the accusation of opportunism made against the Central Committee of the Albanian Communist Party, headed by Enver Hoxha, in connection with their attitude towards the nationalist organization, the Bali Kombëtar. This organization, formed and guided by the reactionary Albanian feudal nobility, presented itself as a national liberation movement, but in practice was holding the people back from joining the People's Liberation Army, Albanian partisans, in resistance to the Axis occupationists. But in the ranks of the Bali Kombëtar were many honest but misguided Albanian patriots. The aim of the Central Committee of the Albanian Communists was to try, in the first instance, to win the genuine patriots in the Bali Kombëtar away from their reactionary leaders. The Titoites, who demanded immediate and direct action against the whole Bali Kombëtar, a seemingly left policy, in actual fact did nothing but aid the Italian blackshirts who were trying to push it into direct action against the Yugoslav partisans. A further stage in the Titoite plot against Albania was developed at the Congress of Berat in November 1944. Here the Albanian Titoite group, headed by Kosik Zox and Pandi Christo, put forward a policy of subordination of Albania to Yugoslavia and of affiliating Albania to a Balkan federation of which Tito Yugoslavia would be the center and the leader. At the same time, a strong factional campaign was launched against Enver Hoxha and other leaders of the Albanian Communist Party. Kosik Zox, like his prototype Rankovic, held the key positions of Organization Secretary of the Albanian Communist Party and Minister of the Interior. Other Albanian Titoites got hold of key positions in party and state. Pandi Christo in the State Control Commission, others in the propaganda department of the Communist Party, in the press and in the Ministry of the Interior. Genuine communist and internationalist cadres were attacked, persecuted, eliminated from key positions. Nako Spiru, Minister of Industry, President of the Planning Commission, and member of the Political Bureau of the party, was driven to suicide by the false accusations of the Titoites. Although they did not dare openly to attack General Enver Hoxha, they did everything they could to disrupt his influence and reputation, censored his correspondence and sent copies to the OZNA, Titoite secret police of Yugoslavia. All patriots who in any way resisted the Yugoslav colonization plans were ruthlessly persecuted. Meanwhile, Albania was being colonized, economically and politically. A sort of Yugoslav Marshall Plan was carried out in Albania under the cover of customs and currency agreements, constitution of mixed companies, coordination of economic plans. A 2 milliard lek credit promised by Yugoslavia was never forthcoming. Profits of the mixed companies were appropriated by the Yugoslavs. Yugoslav technicians spied on and sabotaged Albanian industrial developments. The demand was made that a Yugoslav division should be stationed in Albania and, when this was refused, that there should be a unified military command. At the same time, Kosik Zox was endeavoring to reorganize the Albanian party on the Titoite model. Membership of the party was concealed as in Yugoslavia. The party was dissolved into the Democratic Front. Plots were set on foot for the assassination of Enver Hoxha and other genuine communist leaders who resisted the Titoite policy. Albania was saved, and the Albanian Titoites were eliminated, As a result of the vigilance of the CPSUB and other parties of the Communist Information Bureau, who, with the publication of the resolution on Yugoslavia in mid-1948, alerted all true communists of the danger that their country was facing. After the Information Bureau resolution, the publication of the resolution of the Communist Information Bureau on Yugoslavia in mid-1948 put the communists of Eastern Europe and, indeed, of all the world, on their guard against the Titoites. As for the Tito clique themselves, it forced them into the open, not all at once, but step by step. At first the Titoites swore their loyalty to the Soviet Union, complained that they were being misjudged, and turned their attacks against the leading communists of other countries of Eastern Europe, like Dimitrov in Rákóczi. In a letter addressed to the CPSUB on the 13th of April 1948, answering Soviet criticisms of Yugoslav communist policy and signed by Tito and Kartal, it was stated, for instance, "Our only desire is to eliminate every doubt and disbelief in the purity of the comradely and brotherly feeling of loyalty of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, to whom we will always remain thankful for the Marxist-Leninist doctrine which has led us into now and will lead us in the future. Loyalty to the Soviet Union, which has served us and will continue to serve us as a great example and whose assistance to our people we so highly appreciate." Such language today would mean a long prison sentence for the crime of Kominternfarmism, if not worse. Covering their anti-Soviet policy with a veil of hypocrisy, the Titoites quickly began the attacks on the other people's democracies. The Central Committee of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia must, however, emphasize that in certain countries of people's democracy a whole series of unprovoked attacks have been committed by party and state organs which are insulting to the people of Yugoslavia, etc., etc. Borba statement of 1 July 1948. Meanwhile, the most vicious slanders were launched against communist leaders like Rákóczi and, until his death, Dimitrov. The second stage of Titoite maneuver was that in which, while beginning to direct their attacks against the Soviet Union and the CPSUB, they tried to make it appear that Stalin did not agree with Information Bureau criticisms of Tito, that Zhdanov was responsible, and so on. Demagogic appeals were made to Stalin to come out against the Komintern slanders. But there was little scope for such demagogy, for such unscrupulous maneuver. It was made perfectly clear to the whole world that the whole Central Committee of the CPSUB, including its leader Stalin, had joined in criticizing the Titoite policy. Very quickly a third stage was reached in which the Titoites began openly to slander and attack Soviet policy and the policy of the CPSUB, to slander Stalin, to accuse him of betraying Leninism. By mid-1949 the Titoites had hoisted their real colors and were talking openly the old language of Trotskyism. The May Day proclamation of the Titoite Communist Party of May 1949 denounced the attack upon Yugoslavia coming from the USSR and the people's democracies, though they still proclaimed, in leftist demagogic terms, the dangers of imperialism. The Soviet Union and the people's democracies were denounced as the most serious obstacle to further successful development of the struggle of the workers' democratic peace-loving movement in the world. The demagogy was wearing thin. At the end of May 1949, the political department of the Communist Party Organization of the Yugoslav Army, dominated by the Titoites, was writing of the counter-revolutionary struggle of the USSR and the people's democracies. By July 1949, Chiles was attacking the Soviet Union, Tanjug, the 19th of July 1949, as an exploiter of the new Yugoslavia. The Titoite mask was lifted. At the end of 1949, following the revelations of the Reichenkostoff trials, the Titoite leaders and the Titoite press turned to full, unadulterated anti-Soviet slander. In 1950 they passed into the final stage and became open propagandists for Western imperialism. Thus the infamous Tito plan for weaning the people of Eastern Europe by stages away from the Soviet Union was defeated. The Titoites were exposed, and were themselves forced, by stages, into the open, revealed as anti-Soviet plotters, imperialist agents. And once they were forced into the open, though they remained a dangerous weapon of imperialism, the principal danger, thanks above all to the political wisdom and vigilance of the CPSUB, was past. 6. Conclusion. The Reich-Kostoff and Zox trials revealed what had not yet been clear at the time of the resolution of the Communist Information Bureau in mid-1948. They revealed that the false policy of the Titoite leaders of the Yugoslav Communist Party criticized in the resolution, their anti-Soviet attitude, deviations from Marxism-Leninism, distortion of the role and organization of the Communist Party, bourgeois nationalism, was not just mistaken policy, subject to correction by self-critical understanding of their errors. The trials revealed that this false and disastrous policy was a deliberate and fully conscious policy on the part of the leading Titoites, like Tito himself, Kartal, Chiles, Mosapijade. It was a deliberate policy carried out by Trotskyites, agents provocateurs, who had gained over a whole period commanding positions in the Yugoslav Communist Party, and who, under the instructions of Anglo-American imperialism, were trying to use those positions to restore capitalism in Eastern Europe, to bring the people's democracies of Eastern Europe into the orbit of Western imperialism, to subject these countries to Western imperialism. The trials were a stern warning to communists, genuine socialists and progressives all over the world. It brought home to them in the most urgent terms the need for vigilance. The need never to forget that the class enemy is not for one moment inactive, that capitalism works covertly as well as overtly, that the leading imperialist circles will never cease from their efforts, by every means, to overthrow the states where the working people have conquered power. They could go back with a new sense of urgency to the profound words of Stalin uttered at the meeting of activists of the Moscow Committee of the CPSUB on the 13th of April 1928. It would be stupid to imagine that international capital will leave us in peace. No, comrades, this is not so. Classes exist. International capital exists, and it cannot calmly view the development of the country building socialism. It is one of two things: either we continue to pursue a revolutionary policy, rallying round the working class of the USSR, the proletariat and oppressed of all countries, and international capital will then in every way hamper us in our forward march. Or we reject our revolutionary policy, agree to a number of fundamental concessions to international capital, and then international capital will, in all probability, have no objections to helping us in the degeneration of our socialist country into a good bourgeois republic. Stalin, Collected Works, Russian edition, Volume 11, Pages 5455. The trials revealed that the Titoites had rejected revolutionary policy, that they were being helped by international capital and the degeneration of their country into a bourgeois state, destined, in the dreams of the imperialists, to help turn back history in the whole of Eastern Europe.